People, be they male or female, often want to be more toned and more muscular, and central to becoming toned and muscular is building actual muscle and consuming protein. So, can you explain how protein consumption can affect muscle growth and muscle recovery, especially for those people who are thinking of going into the gym, people who are already active and are looking to lift heavier weights than they've lifted before?
A lot of my own work with protein was more on high dose protein because there were so many myths. I mean, being dually trained in exercise physiology, we tend to be pro protein. And in dietetics, at least back when I was being trained, it was more negative, frankly. Like, we probably all heard comments like high dose protein harms your kidneys or weakens your bones or causes gout. I mean, there's any number of these they're kind of myths, to be honest. And they're population specific, right? And I think that's something that a lot of my dietetics colleagues would be good to remember, frankly, is it's very population specific. So if I have chronic kidney disease or one kidney or something like that, then yeah, maybe I wouldn't ask that organ to process all of that extra nitrogen, right, and shed it. But from an efficacy perspective, the field is just evolving so quickly. My rule, and as someone who is also personally involved in weightlifting, right, the combination is so important because it's the stimulus. I think the interesting thing for people who are just getting into it is they need to realize that protein is really two things. It's building blocks, right, the amino acids that make up the protein, right, the 20 amino acids, the 9-ish that are essential and your body can't make or indispensable. That's important, but also key amino acids like leucine, of course, are a trigger for muscle protein synthesis. So it's both. A friend of mine, Phil Stevens, that I do a podcast with, he's like, oh, so leucine is sort of like the light switch. You flick it on. But then all the other amino acids have to be present, right, for muscle building to take place, for muscle protein synthesis to happen. So that's like the electricity coming through the wire. So it's interesting that protein can provide the leucine, especially very rich leucine sources like whey protein, which is so popular, of course, in sports. But the leucine flicks on the light switch, and then all the other amino acids are there to say, yeah, hey, let's build some contractile proteins. Let's build that muscle tissue. So it's both building blocks and a stimulus. And when you stack that on top of the stimulus of resistance training, it's very beneficial. And so I've often threatened to write an article called "What May I Eat?" Because since I have been trained as an undergrad, we've heard, I grew up in the fat is bad era, right? Like low fat, no fat. And then maybe 15 years ago, we started the whole carbs are bad. And then when I hear stuff like high dose protein is bad, I'm like, then that's the 3 macros. What's left to eat? So I do think when you look at the data, especially as people age, and I am older now, we don't get enough protein. You actually have to kind of seek it. And when I say protein, and I think we need to be careful, I don't mean a Big Mac diet. I mean chicken breasts. A lot of the research I did on diet quality and whether or not high protein intakes affect diet quality, because that's another critique, is that high protein diets are high cholesterol, high fat, high sodium processed food diets. And that's not true. Growing up as a competitive bodybuilder, we would eat 1 or even 2 chicken breasts, and then the rest of the plate was green beans or broccoli, or, high protein diets aren't necessarily damaging to your overall diet quality. And I think you have to be intentional for that to happen. I mean, it's not entirely wrong for some people to say high protein diets may, do X, Y, and Z, but I think they're conflating what a high protein diet is with all the other junk that comes with, a combo meal at a fast food restaurant, so.
Talk to me then about where you stand as far as how much protein we should be consuming per day. As we said before this interview, I spoke with Dr. Ted Naiman and Dr. Don Lehman, and they gave me a kind of a ballpark figure. Certainly, they agreed with you in the sense that we're not consuming enough, regardless of how old we are.
Yeah, I'm going to give you my perspective because I am not Don Lehman's equal when it comes to protein. I will tell you, though, from a practical standpoint, I have always personally shot for a gram of protein per pound of body weight. Now, is that excessive? Yeah, it's probably more. It's certainly more than the RDA that we have here in the States, right, which is 0.8 grams per kg, which is very low. I think there's been a real move toward more like 1.0, 1.1, or even higher amounts of protein. And again, when I say protein, I mean things like skinless, boneless chicken breasts and low-fat cottage cheese, or, that kind of stuff. I'm not talking about, again, a fast food type diets where it's conflated and there's a bunch of junk that comes along with the protein. So, yeah, I mean, a gram per pound, I think, is excessive. Which would, 2.2 grams per kg if you want to do it that way. The literature is pretty clear. We need probably around double the RDA if you're active with resistance training and you're growing muscle tissue and you're in an anabolic state. So 1.6 grams. But again, that excess, if you will, between 1.6 grams per kg and the 2.2 that I've always kind of leaned on, I don't always get there now that I'm older, but I still think I try. But protein it has a high satiety value, right? It's filling and it's metabolically boosting. The thermic effect of food from protein is much higher than carbs and fats. So I feel like that little bit of excess, if anything, is just helpful to, to body composition, because if we're not getting enough protein, as we just touched on, and we're probably overeating in other ways, processed foods, empty calories, then a little bit of extra protein, I think, could be a good thing. So I'm not going to hard cap myself at 1.6 or 1.8 grams per kg. I'll go up to a gram per pound, the 2.2 grams per kg myself. So,
are there any potential downsides to long-term consumption of a high-protein diet? You mentioned already, and you dispelled the myth about kidney damage and its association with a high-protein diet, but are there any negative effects at all?
One thing I saw in the lab doing a lot of the high-protein stuff, because, for example, we would compare people that were matched on their fitness status and their weight training volume and all that sort of thing. We looked at kidney function and we looked at bone density and all that kind of thing. The one thing that does stand out is that you urinate more. But I don't want people to think that dehydrates you. It sounds a little contradictory, but when you're consuming protein, I mean, we would think about the study. The design would have to be such that I gave you large amounts of very dry protein, not shakes, because that's fluid. I would have to almost dehydrate you anyway, like stop the fluid coming in and give the protein. But in any case, just because of the way that the body processes it, yeah, you see urine outputs that are much higher. So I was getting people would come in that weren't protein seekers. They were physically active, but not protein seekers. And they might be urinating like 1.5 liters a day. And some of the guys on the very high protein diets, because we didn't prescribe a diet. It was just, it was a sort of a semi-experimental design where we're letting people eat what they do. We weren't feeding them huge protein intakes. We were letting them do that. And then we just wanted to kind of sample them and say, what do you look like, physiologically? And they were peeing, some of them 3 liters a day, so double. So yeah, I mean, my two interests, it's kind of funny because I've really moved from protein to coffee in a lot of ways, but both of these things can really induce a lot of urination. So, when you overdo the coffee and you eat a high protein diet, you're going to be going to the bathroom a lot. It doesn't mean that it's harming your kidneys. There's an old hypothesis called the Brenner hypothesis that if you ask the kidneys to process more of this nitrogen and put it into your pee as urea, right, that it damages it. But as an exercise physiologist, I've always found that absurd. You can ask your biceps to do more work. It doesn't just tear off the bone and give up. It hypertrophies, it adapts, it becomes good at that. So asking an organ or a tissue to do its job, if it's healthy, I don't think is automatically damaging. And that Brenner hypothesis, I've written papers on this before. I think that's been largely dispelled, of course, because so long as we don't, again, conflate high protein intakes with, a fast food diet, because that's not accurate.
You alluded to whey protein already. I want to get your opinion on the proliferation of the use of various forms of protein powder, whey protein isolate, and various other forms of protein powder. Do you think there's a need for it, or do you think a balanced diet, a high protein whole food diet, is sufficient to meet people's protein requirements?
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because I was just complaining to my wife last week that I probably overdo the dairy proteins, not because there's anything wrong with whey or casein, right? Like if you think about milk, it's 20% whey, 80% casein. Or cottage cheese, that's mostly casein. And whey is a fast protein. Casein clots in your stomach is considered a slow protein, that sort of thing. But I over-rely, if anything, I think, on dairy proteins. They're very high quality, but I actually try to push myself to, don't forget the chicken breasts, Lonnie. Like back when you used to compete and diet for competitions, you really lean heavy on, just chicken breasts and whole food on your plate kind of thing. So, but I think in order to comply, especially older people who don't get enough, drinking is very convenient. And dairy proteins lend themselves to like protein shakes and the little Tetra Packs and things like that, where, again, it becomes sort of a convenience issue. It's a very high protein or high quality protein. If you look at the PDCAS or the DIAS, these different protein quality scales, right? We've moved way beyond just complete versus incomplete protein sources, but they're very high quality and they're very convenient. And I think that's why I tend to lean into them, maybe more than I really should. I just think I like variety, right? I mean, as a nutritionist and a nutrition professor of 25 years, I think one of the key pillars of nutrition is variety. And I don't like to limit my variety by leaning on one thing too much, that's all.
Another area that you're expressing interest in, certainly in recent years, and that is coffee. That'll pique a lot of interest in people out there who are coffee lovers. It seems the whole world became a lover of coffee, especially during the pandemic. It was a national pastime here in Ireland, certainly. Could you talk to me about the significance of coffee and more specifically coffee bioactives? What are they and what do they do?
Over the years, I think, painting with a broad brush, I'm a bigger fan of coffee, whether it's like a pre-workout setting. That's one of the things I've looked at the most is coffee as a pre-workout beverage. Because of the myriad chemicals in there, all those bioactives, it seems to be a better choice than like an energy drink or something like that. In fact, I'm working on a paper right now comparing some of the potential adverse events from coffee and the caffeine and everything that it entails with energy drinks. The funny thing is when you look at the literature, not to spoil what I'm about to submit here, but is that the coffee literature tends to lean toward positivity, some of the chronic effects, like anti-diabetic effects or different brain health parameters. Whereas energy drinks, it's kind of geared and leaned negative. And I don't know if it's just like sort of the natural versus synthetic thing, which I think we have to be careful. That's not always a good indicator. But yeah, so coffee has, it has a high like a nutrient density, if you will, because there's a lot of good things per calorie. And when I say coffee, we got to define coffee, right? Like this is black coffee, a little bit of sweetener sometimes, but it's not a sugar bomb, caramel macchiato latte thing, right? Because I think that really kind of, we're back to like what we said about protein. Is it just the natural, is it the whole food, or is it some, processed abomination, frankenfood? But so I originally was very interested in chlorogenic acid, and I published a big literature review with the Journal of the International Society of Sports Nutrition on this. Chlorogenic acids, it's not just one thing, but they may have effects on their own when it comes to like cognition and reaction time and things like that. There's been some fascinating research with like green coffee extracts because they'll have more chlorogenic acids in them. But there's trigonylene is something that I'm just fascinated with. A paper came out recently, and if you look, there's actually some patents that are Nestle-related patents on muscle preservation, like being anti-sarcopenic and that kind of thing. It's a niacin-like compound, and it may be acting. There's a brand new paper that came out suggesting it may be acting in a similar way to these other NAD boosters, if you've heard of those for longevity. A lot of the longevity pundits are very interested in NAD boosters, cellular energy status, and trigonylene may do that. may have an effect on that, a clinically relevant effect that literature is still developing, of course. Yeah, so I mean, when you think about it, like there are some papers suggest that at least in the States, people get more antioxidants from coffee than from fruits and vegetables. That's a sad commentary on how little fruits and vegetables, but again, yay coffee, I guess. It's in that regard. So yeah, chlorogenic acids, trigonylene, there's diterpenes, there's hundreds and hundreds of compounds. And I'm trying to, in fact, I'm just putting together a book chapter on the different compounds and the different brew methods that might cause the extraction, right, to be sort of optimal, like what's in the cup. So yeah, when it comes to coffee, I would suggest anybody define like what is a cup of coffee. It's one of the first things I try to do when I write about it, because there's the volume, there's the grind, the fineness of the grind. There's the roasting, how much roasting, like roasting will bring out some things and destroy other things. Like if it's very dark roast versus light versus green coffee. Brew method, like cold brew, paper, filter, pour over. There's just all these different things. And it's the challenge in coffee literature, especially in my field like sports nutrition, is you have to get operational definitions for all these things, because it's not as simple as a caffeine pill. That's caffeine and there's caffeine. This is, I mean, some binders or whatever in the tablet, but you get my point. And coffee is all these other things. So when you do kind of compare coffee versus caffeine in a study, it's kind of hard. You just match it on the caffeine intake. Is that fair? It just becomes a real challenge because it's a food item, and it varies hugely in what it actually is, right? So I lean toward, one of the conclusions from the review was about 4 cups a day. It seems to be very helpful. The literature, again, it's not always crystal clear. Chronic observational studies that aren't causal, I know, but they tend to suggest anti-diabetic and antidepressive and other effects. Like they just number of cups per day versus the scores, on whatever it might be, like A1C, hemoglobin A1C in your blood, or blood glucose, or different depressive markers with some instrument. But the acute studies, and I've done some, like what does coffee do right now over the next 2 hours? If you drink coffee and give a glucose challenge, it's really mixed, because caffeine will tend to raise blood sugar, as I'm sure you're aware, right? It causes a bit of adrenaline, epinephrine response, and that can raise blood sugar. But then you have these other compounds in the coffee, like the chlorogenic acids, that might be trying to drive down. So when it comes to blood sugar or even like blood flow, some of the compounds in coffee may enhance blood flow, but then caffeine kind of meddles with that. So it's kind of paradoxical, and it depends on what's in the cup. I was talking to a friend of mine who's a English professor, and you know how scientists talk. I mean, we're full of caveats. Like, at this dose in this population, is it a man? Is it a woman? How big is the cup? Is it dark roast? Is it, fine ground? How did you brew it? Was it the temperature? I mean, there's so many things that go into this kind of stuff that oftentimes people want you to paint with such a broad brush. You just kind of can't with a food item like coffee. Bean type, I didn't even mention like Arabica versus Robusta beans, right? Robusta is much higher in caffeine. So there's a ton that goes into that. And so when you do a lit review like we did, it is hard to paint with a broad brush and say, it's about 4 cups a day, depending on how you're drinking your coffee. And, and the population specificity matters, the processing and the grind and the brew method and all roasting and all that matters. So yeah, it's a complex issue.
In spite of that complexity, is there any consensus as to whether coffee long-term is good for us, or is it bad for us? Or are there certain cohorts of society whereby it's better for them and it's worse for other cohorts?
If I had to make a distinction, I'd say good. I mean, coffee is good. I mean, if we're getting more antioxidants, at least here in the States, from coffee and some of those polyphenols than we are from almost anything else, then I think it's a good thing. I think over time, I'm pretty convinced, that there are anti-diabetic effects, and there are Because some of the compounds in coffee are dopaminergic. They can cause dopamine release, and that can have brain health improvements. So I don't think it's harmful. There was a Prop 65 in California where they tried to take just one specific component in coffee and say, oh, look, it looks carcinogenic. But you have to think about this complex food matrix. And so overall, if anything, coffee probably reduces oral cancer or whatever, they were, I think, prematurely trying to be concerned about. And eventually that was overturned. But I think healthy overall, brain health and metabolic health. And it's one of those things I have to be careful because as a coffee drinker myself, I have to remind myself as a scientist, you have to be careful finding things that you want to hear. Like you have to resist the siren song of, people love to hear about the positive benefits of dark chocolate or chocolate in general. And because they love chocolate, they're biased. So I have to be careful not to become biased. But regardless of that, the literature really suggests healthful effects. There's not a ton of downsides other than what might be obvious. If you overconsume caffeine, it can cause restlessness and jitters, and some people that hits more than others. There's some indication in the literature, for example, that the caffeine from coffee or just caffeine in general might affect women more. It's far from definitive, right? But when you look at the metabolism of it in the literature, I just see these indications that keep cropping up. Women's livers metabolize the enzyme systems that break down caffeine. They're, in a lay term, I guess I could say, distracted by estrogen. So if they're working and focused on estrogen, those same enzyme systems might not be breaking down the caffeine. I've also seen, just to kind of corroborate that, literature that women may get more jitters and that kind of thing. Now, the first thing people might think is, yeah, but Lowery, I'm telling you, that's just a relative dose thing. It's a per kg. A grande from Starbucks means more to a 100-pound woman than a 200-pound man. I'm painting with a broad brush here. But I don't think it's just that. It's not just relative dose. There are metabolic differences. Women are not just slightly smaller men. And we have to embrace that, right? And do studies with women to see, in fact, is that true? What I've seen in the lab is similar performance benefits. But again, there could be metabolic differences. And it's not just estrogen from a birth control pill. It could be just natural estrogen. Again, there's indications that keep cropping up in the literature. And as someone who's looked at a lot of it over the last 2 years, it does make me think that, I guess, said in a positive way, like I originally stated, women may be getting more out of a cup of coffee. So makes me almost a little jealous in that way, I guess.
Well, actually, I'm one of those people who can't drink coffee because it makes me so jittery. So I'm sitting on the sidelines whenever I'm talking about coffee. My final question for you is this. You alluded to myths earlier on that are perpetuated in the field of science. I want to ask you about what is that pet peeve of yours? What is that misconception that you see in the media or in popular science that is perpetuated, that you think every time you see it, you roll your eyes up to heaven and you think, not again, not again? Do you have any of those that come to mind?
Sagan talked about, he used the term paradoxers for people that would push pseudoscience, stuff that's on the edge of science. And you can already hear the way I'm talking, there's some indication, I can't really say for sure, caveats and control issues. Science moves forward in inch-wise ways, so a lot of people, they want you to over-conclude, and we can't. So we're like, well, the literature is unclear on this or this or this. It's population-specific, whatever it might be. But what I can't stand is where you'll see gurus on YouTube, what Sagan would call paradoxers. They'll take bits of the science and triple down on it because they're trying to create their niche. It's more about capitalism than it is the science. They want something to be the reason everybody's wrong. It's like one of those red flags, typical consumer red flags, like overuse of medical terminology to try to baffle people with BS, or ignoring the other side of the evidence and that sort of thing. So people are doing it for capitalistic reasons. They're trying to create a niche that sometimes doesn't exist, whether it's for a dietary supplement product or a training program or whatever, what have you. And then, these gurus are on YouTube and they have a voice. I grew up, I sound like a curmudgeon here, but editors were gatekeepers, and those are kind of gone. Now, there's pros and cons with that, I know, because they can create good old boys and good old girls networks and that sort of thing. But anybody can massively publish whatever they want, like on a YouTube channel. And oftentimes there's huge conflicts of interest. And so they're abusing science to create a niche that really doesn't exist, or to, push a product or their little training system, whatever that might be. They also love to put their own name on the system, on the diet or the training, and reinvent the world in their image, and I think they're ignoring decades or hundreds of years of geniuses that they're trying to stand on their shoulder, and they're just abusing that data for personal gain. So yeah, that's my gripe, I guess.
Well, there you go. There's some red flags for you to look out for. Something else to look out for is that upcoming paper that you mentioned on coffee. When do you think that will be published?
Oh, I don't know. That's in review right now. We just submitted it late summer. So that will be with Springer Nature. I don't know what else I can say about that. I have to be cautious about it. There are a couple of papers people can find, again, in the Journal of the International Society of Sports Nutrition, JISSN, good literature reviews, and they really kind of forced us for consumer-friendly kind of way to like sum it up. What are the bullets? It's at the beginning of the article. It's like, what if you had to conclude, what would you say? And, we put forward more than half a dozen, comments there.
Well, we'll keep an eye out for the publication of that at some time in the future, and possibly 2025. Listen, for the moment, thank you so much for your time today. Really enjoyed listening to some of your answers and your expertise on the podcast. Dr. Lonnie Lowery, thank you so much.
No, I appreciate the opportunity.
Hey, if you enjoyed that video, check out this video here, which tells you how to get rid of that stubborn belly fat.